to many of you, we have been through a fantastic series of panels discussing great work on Japan and comparative politics and international relations, featuring many of Susan's students. And Susan has, of course, been offering the best of comments, as she always does. And I think this shows she's not ready to retire, and we're not ready to let her retire because we still value her comments and insights. That said, this is an event in honor of her retirement, and I welcome all of you who are joining. It is now Susan's chance to offer us her reflections, thinking back on a truly incredible career and looking forward to the start of the next phase.
Well, I want to thank all of you for joining this occasion. I know all of us are suffering from Zoom fatigue. I'm certainly suffering from it at this very moment. And also with a longing that we all have to be outside and socialize. So for those of you who've joined all or part of the panels today, I feel very grateful for you for staying on for a few closing remarks. I, for one, am feeling somewhat overwhelmed by having so many nice things said about me, all in a short, compressed point of time, and from people from so many parts of the globe. That includes one of my very first students at the University of Wisconsin, who is now in Bangkok, and thanks to Zoom, will be present has been present for part of the proceedings. It includes a current student, an MA student whose thesis I just advised. So all of this now collapsed into this extraordinary world that we're in. And to make it all more surreal, I sit there looking at all of you out there and thinking, these people are probably all wearing flip-flops at my retirement event. So the panelists today are outstanding and established scholars today. But of course, I knew them much, much earlier when they were chewing their knuckles and scrabbling around working on their dissertations. And it has been a privilege to slog along with them through that stage that's so difficult for just about everyone. And I have to say, because I've known them for such a long time, it gave me the feeling today of being like a nervous mother with a very large brood of children, talented children, each of which had to climb up onto the stage one by one for a piano recital. So I now find myself sort of wanting to be in the front row cheering and also looking around to others to make sure they're cheering too. But honestly, it was really wonderful to hear you. And it was fascinating how the panel and the panelists had so much to say to one another. When I see you also, I have to think of the innumerable letters of recommendation I have written through the years that if lined up end to end would circle the planet and emit a steady, radiant glow. Henry Lawrence ended his presentation today by showing a slide of his wedding with him and his bride, Sarah, and me. And it reminded me of all the many ways I have known you through the years. And I never understood in the beginning that being an advisor was forever. So that I'm now writing letters for some of you who are under consideration for a named chair. You know, things go to the very last stage. And how many parents I've met, meeting Amy Kettlenek's mother in New Zealand, meeting Henry's parents in England. So that long relationship is really to be treasured and has enormously enriched my life. I owe, of course, a very profound debt of gratitude to Christina, who is now a colleague of mine in the government department, for organizing and hosting this splendid event. I never knew when Christina first came to my office as an undergraduate about to take my junior seminar in East Asian Studies, that so many years later, she would be a colleague on the faculty at Harvard. I do want to say that because of the nature of Zoom and people's Zoom tolerance, today we could have only a limited number of panels, but in fact, there are really other 2/3 of students, both at Wisconsin and at Harvard, whose theses I advised who were not with us today, but are very much in my hearts. And as the pictures scroll by, I see so many wonderful and familiar faces, and those would be PhD students. But in addition, there are many undergraduates whose theses I advised, and a great many MA theses I advised through a program that I think is really extraordinary, the Master's Regional Studies East Asia program, through which actually it has been my privilege to see a number of its graduates, my former advisees, rise to positions of great importance, including in Japan, where several are now on the diet, and one is currently on the cabinet, and others are now in leading positions in Japanese bureaucracy, including in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and having leading roles. And Jenny Lin was reminding me that not only were there the Harvard students, but the students at MIT, and in addition, the many, many postdoctoral fellows who've come through Harvard, through the program on US-Japan relations, and also the visiting scholars of the program on US-Japan relations, and also the Harvard Academy of International and Area Studies, with which I've been associated going all the way back to the 1990s. And it's been my privilege to watch those talented scholars develop. And certainly that would be true of the Reicher Institute also, for which I served as director for a number of years, now under the leadership of Mary Brinton. And finally, someone alluded to the Mansfield program that I've been associated with, but I did want to mention that in the last decade, it's been an especially meaningful kind of mentoring role that it's been my privilege to play in relation to a Network for the Future program that has brought together talented Japan experts at an early stage of their career to give them policy experience. And I know many of you who are here today in that guise. I was mentally preparing for kind of what to say, and a friend, a WAG, sent me a list of 5 pointers, and 4 of which were keep it short. So I will do my best, but I did want to just say just a few words, because I won't attempt to summarize the panels today, but their subject, after all, was Japan. And so let me offer a few reflections on my own long engagement with Japan. And I'll really answer 3 questions. The first is to tell you how it was that I got interested in Japan. And the second is what has been the intellectual appeal and the personal appeal of Japan that has sustained that interest over a very long period of time. And finally, in this era in which naturally people are thinking about gender and identity, it's very much in people's thoughts, I do want to say a few words about being a woman in academia and in Japanese studies at a time when women were incredibly scarce in those fields, particularly in political science. So the first thing is how I became interested in Japan. Now, some of you know my story, but I'll tell it to you tonight. It was not a likely thing to happen. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and until I was 22 years old, I had never met a Japanese person. I went to Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and to the best of my memory, they had only one course in the entire university that even dealt with Asia. It was called History of Asia. I didn't take it. So it happened, though, that I did get a fellowship that allowed me to go to graduate school at Columbia to pursue a PhD, Columbia University in New York. So at age 22, I packed my bags, took the train to New York City, and I settled in at International House on Riverside Drive. Only a few weeks after arriving in New York, and truly, I was a fish out of water as someone coming from Atlanta, Georgia, into Manhattan in the middle of the 1960s. But I was walking through the lobby of International House, and I saw a small handwritten sign that said, "Judo instruction offered on Sundays." And I stopped in my tracks, and what I heard in my ear was the voice of my mother with her anxiety about me being in New York and walking the streets of New York in a very dangerous city, particularly at that time, a very dangerous city. And I didn't know much about judo, but I did know that it could teach you some defensive moves. So I thought, why not? So on Sunday, I decided to go to the judo, to the gym of International House, opened the door, and got the shock of my life, because here were about 27 Japanese men about my age, all wearing judo gi with black belts. And there were at the side of the room a couple of Americans. I started to turn around and leave the room, but then I remembered the sign had been in English, so they must be wanting people who spoke English to come. And in fact, they wanted to have Americans in the class. These were Japanese who were at Columbia, at Juilliard, and around the city, who were in some cases studying English as a foreign language, but taking judo as recreation. And so they persuaded me to stay in the class with the other Americans. And from then on, things just rolled along with a certain logic. Pretty soon after judo, we went out to a Chinese restaurant, and very patiently, they taught me how to use chopsticks. And then we decided to take the subway into Manhattan, and we went to a Japanese restaurant, and I had sushi for the first time. And in fact, that may have actually been quite decisive, because I took to sushi immediately. But then, having gotten to know, spending a lot of time with the Japanese in the class and hearing so much about Japan from them, I started thinking, I'll take a course. So I took a course with James Morley on Japanese politics. And then from then on, everything moved in that direction. Now, I should explain that it actually made intellectual sense, an academic sense, because my field was comparative politics. And at Columbia at that time, you were required to study 3 world areas. So I had studied the UK, I was studying West Africa and studying the Hausa language, and I was looking for a 3rd area. So there was a kind of congruence of the judo experience and taking a course on Japan with the real need I had to find a 3rd world area. But then we get to the second point of what is it, the appeal of Japan. So that's how I got interested in Japan. But what was sustaining about it? What I could have just taken a course and moved on. But there's been a durability of the appeal of Japan. And I have to say that I had a lot of thoughts about this today, listening to Philip's presentation on Japan as a harbinger, in which you talked about on certain issues, Japan's star moves into ascendance. And it, as a model for other countries, countries watch what Japan is doing because it's of great interest to other people. And I was in academics at exactly the time when Japan's star was in ascendance. Henry Rosofsky, who's sitting there, will know just what I mean, because it was the middle of the study of modernization. Countries around the world were newly becoming independent, and they were looking on how to develop economically and how to develop into modern statehood. And therefore, as scholars, and hundreds of scholars were engaged in trying to understand modernization, but as they looked for models, two countries stood out for study, and one of them was Japan in the Meiji period and Turkey under Ataturk. And in fact, my first advisor at Columbia, before I moved on to James Morley, was a man who wrote a book called Political Modernization in Japan and Turkey. He, by the way, once greeted me on campus because he had many students from the Middle East and from Turkey. He once greeted me on campus by saying, "Oh, Mrs. Zavanovich, how was Turkey this summer?" And so they kind of got me mixed up for a while. So that was because I was so immersed in the questions that political scientists were asking at that time about economic development and about modernization. This led me into deeply study late Tokugawa Japan and the Meiji period. And I have to say, I found them and still find those periods incredibly fascinating. And then later on, there were other intellectual questions, including those about modern Japan that engaged me, but certainly my first sustaining intellectual interest was in the Meiji period. The third thing I just wanted to mention is about the experience of, I should say just a couple of other things. So why else did I really stick with Japan? Well, one is, I think that people are sort of simpatico with the part of the world they study. Someone on an earlier panel today said that I am sort of a rather formal person. And I am actually a person who kind of cares about politeness. In Japan, let's face it, it is a country where people are somewhat more formal, and they are really quite attentive to social relations and politeness. So I think there was actually a fit in personality terms. I will add that. And the other thing I would simply say as a political scientist at that time, that I thought the literature on Japan was really wonderful. I loved reading it. I loved reading about Tokugawa Japan. And I found it, from that standpoint, a field of great depth. So let me now just move on to the whole thing of the experience of being a woman in the field. So when I arrived at Columbia University, until then, actually, I hadn't been particularly aware of any issues that women were facing. Maybe I was, retrospectively, I can see issues, but at the time I wasn't. But I have to say, I hit Columbia at a time when there were extraordinarily few women in the PhD program. And I did feel very marginal. I felt at times invisible. And I suspect some of you, the women who are listening to me tonight, will relate to what I experienced then and have experienced in many other times in my life, where you're in a room, as there's a seminar, whatever, hold up your hand, you make a point, and the professor whoever's running the seminar doesn't pay any attention. And then a few minutes later, a man holds up his hand and makes exactly the same point, and the professor's face lights up and he says, "Bob, what a great point." And I have to say, at Columbia, it seemed to me that that happened a lot. And there was also a problem for me as a woman coming from the South, that my mother had told me to never interrupt. How do you get into a discourse in a graduate seminar, and certainly at Columbia University, with not just interrupting, but putting an elbow out there to claim a very large space on, physically speaking, on the table? So the truth is, for several years at Columbia, I hardly asked a word, a question, or said anything in seminars, to the point that finally my new advisor, James Morley, when I went into his office, obviously saying, I'm your advisee, he said, who are you? You know, he had no idea. So we began to negotiate, and ultimately I got him to call on me in seminars so that I could say something. So it took me several years to ever say anything. So the other thing, experience that stands out about a woman was discovering up front what the job market was like for women. One summer, I didn't have funding. So I went out into Manhattan thinking, here I am. I have a master's from Columbia University. Surely it's going to be not so difficult to find a decent summer job. And I was shocked because everywhere I went, the only jobs available to an educated woman, they were all secretarial. And the question wasn't, can you type? They assumed you typed. The question was, how fast can you type? And the truth is, I was a terrible typist. So I ended up, the only job I could get was as a sales clerk at Macy's. And the lesson I derived from this was I had better get my nose to the grindstone and get a PhD, because that so far I've been pretty good at doing. But later on in life, I've talked to people, and maybe if Michael wouldn't mind my mentioning his name, but I remember once talking to Michael, and he was saying, well, you know, if the PhD doesn't work out or business school doesn't work out, I can always go into finance. And I thought, wow, that is just amazing to feel that there is this world of possibility in employment. So how did these different strands of my experience affect things? Well, they've affected me in a lot of ways, and this is why I'm talking about my early life and experience. My experience as a woman had a profound effect on me. One is that, as Margarita today in her presentation, she talked about my first book on political women in Japan. It certainly was important in guiding me towards topics relating to women. I was curious to understand women and women's situation better. It also, that particular strand also has led me to take a particular pleasure during my life, in a lifetime of experience, in being a mentor basically to women students. I genuinely enjoy it because I had many struggles along the way, and I did learn something from that, and I feel a desire to impart that and to follow the new kinds of challenges that women face. And I would say through the years, I've particularly enjoyed taking part in seminars at places like Showa University with Mariko Bando and many other Tokyo Women's Conference. It's a long relationship with, and my deep relationships and friendships with Japanese women, including Japanese women scholars. So that strand of the experience of being a woman has been really quite profound through the years and affecting many other things. My interest in the Meiji period also was really quite important, because I developed a long-standing interest out of that modernization theory period of my life in trying to understand development. And that led me to, for example, spend a year with AID in Washington looking at Japanese aid policy. It led me to develop a relationship, being on the board of the Asia Foundation, based in San Francisco, that has field offices throughout Asia. And it meant that I have traveled in virtually every country in Asia, looking at development projects and trying to understand developments and development. And in that process, I became particularly interested on the ground in the role that civil society organizations play. And that led me in recent years, really, well, I shouldn't say recent, because really for the last 20 years, I have taught a graduate seminar and an undergraduate course at Harvard on civil society West and East, a course I teach with Grzegorz Eckert, and a course on globalization and civil society for undergraduates. And finally, there are so many other things to say, but I would say that, let's face it, the way I discovered Japan was a fluke. Not many people happen to open a door in their residence hall and discover 27 men, Japanese men in black belts. It just doesn't happen, right? So the way most people are going to learn about Japan, unless their family was in traveling or whatever, is going to be through some kind of internship or summer program. So I have had a longstanding interest in trying to develop internships in Japan for Harvard students and for others. I've also been very, very interested in working with organizations like the US-Japan Bridging Foundation that are trying to send American students to Japan, and in fact have sent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of American college students to Japan. So all of these different strands early on have influenced my choices. And that's really what I would like to say today. I want to thank from the bottom of my heart Shin Fujihira, who I've worked with for such a long time and whom I so much admire. And I see Ted Yeoman here, and he too I work with so closely through the Reicher Institute, and the whole staff of the US-Japan program now under Christina's leadership. And thank you all.
Thank you so very much, Susan. This is bringing us near the end of our symposium, but not at all the end, because clearly the legacy of your students, your research, all of the institutions you have built is going to continue giving in the years to come. And we know you're going to continue as the senior advisor for the program on US-Japan relations, be part of the Harvard community. And I wish we could have had an in-person event, although it's wonderful we could welcome people from all over to join today. But I also hope that people will be stopping by when they're visiting Harvard so that we can all see and continue to celebrate all that you've done for so many of us in the room. I know that we want to have pictures. Events always end with picture taking. It's a Japanese tradition. And so even in Zoom, we need to take a picture. For those who want privacy, you may turn off your screen. But if you'd like to be part of this commemorative shot, please show your picture and hold for a moment so that we can go through the many screens, because we do have 120 people joining us. And so it will take a couple of pictures. So I would ask if you could just please smile for Susan for a little bit. Right. I think we have had our photo moment. We should give a last hurrah to Susan, but as I say, we're all going to be continuing to see her. Thank you all to the program on US-Japan relations who have organized this symposium. Shin Fujihira, Emma Duncan, Amy and Sophie Welsh have all contributed a lot to organizing this. Thank you to all of the panelists who contributed speaking in the symposium. And thank you for joining to honor Susan. And most of all, thank you, Susan, for everything.